other publications. His 5 previous books include In the Neighborhood, The Search for Community on an American Street, One Sleepover at a Time, winner of a Barnes & Noble's Discover Award, and the first annual Zaccalo Public Square Book Prize, and Portrait of a Burger as a Young Cat, a first-hand attempt to understand the food chain. Mr. Lovenheim holds a degree in journalism from Boston University and in law from Cornell Law School. He teaches narrative nonfiction at the Writers Center in Bethesda, Maryland, and splits his time between his hometown of Rochester, New York, and Washington, D.C. I just want to read something written by a member of ours about Peter's new book, The Attachment Effect, which will be for sale at the end, if you're interested. It's from Judith Viorst. The richly informative, deeply researched, touchingly personal, and readable book about the meaning and uses of attachment theory explores the hows and whys of our complicated connections with each other. It offers valuable insights into what makes a relationship fail or succeed, and how a better understanding of our attachment style might help to rescue a floundering relationship. Here's Peter.
Does this work?
Yep.
You can hear it?
No.
No?
Not so well.
All right, I'll keep talking until it starts. Ooh,
Yeah.
now it's too loud.
No.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. That's good?
Yeah.
Shana Torah, everybody.
Oh, for you?
I was going to start with a joke related to the holidays. And I heard one that I thought was really funny, but I understand it's a really old joke. So I decided not to tell it.
We won't.
Tell it.
I'm so glad you persuaded me. So the young boy is standing in the lobby of the shul, looking up at a plaque on the wall. It has a lot of names, and on either side of the names there's American flags. Just then the rabbi comes over, and the boy says, "Rabbi, what's that plaque all about?" The rabbi puts his arm around the boy and says, "Well, David, those are the men and women of our congregation who died in the service." And the boy looks at the rabbi and kind of whispers, "Which service was it?" Rosh Hashanah or Yom Kippur? Yeah, okay. The topic I want to talk about, attachment theory, attachment science, is a really big topic. And it's not something we can cover in the half an hour that I want to speak. And I hope we can cover more of it in your questions. So I just want to hit some of the highlights to share with you what I discovered to be one of the most fascinating areas of psychology and human development and social psychology that I'm aware of. To try to put this topic in the biggest frame, let me ask, how many people have sent cheek swabs or saliva samples to 23andMe, Ancestry.com, one of the other testing companies? Yeah, this is getting very popular. In fact, I read recently that 12.5 million Americans in the last 2 years have sent in DNA samples to be analyzed. And I think this is understandable because it reflects a very deep need we all have to understand ourselves, to understand who we are. And the information we get from this is really interesting. It tells us what continents our ancestors may have come from, maybe what diseases we're most susceptible to. But in another sense, I don't think these DNA tests tell us the most important parts of that question about who we are. And I think those are what shaped our personalities, and why do we act the way we do. Genetic tests reveal, if you will, the nature part of who we are, but not the nurture part. But to unlock the other side of the nature-nurture equation, that age-old question about who we are, we now do have another tool. That's what I've come to understand. And that tool is attachment theory. So that's a large frame, I think, to understand the topic today. Among the things I'll be talking about are some of the benefits of having what is called a secure attachment. Unfortunately, writing a book about attachment doesn't give you a secure attachment. And actually, reading a book about attachment will not give you a secure attachment. However, buying a book on attachment, that just might do it. So we do have books over here. I'm very glad to say that the proceeds will go to support Temple Micah. And just on a serious note, I'm really glad both to be here today. I feel honored to have been invited, and also really glad to help support Micah. When I came down to DC just 4 years ago, because my adult kids all moved here, I didn't know anybody except the kids, really. And I want to tell you that of all the institutions that I made contact with that first year, far and away, Micah was the most welcoming. And I want to mention particularly the Meeting Micah Friends program, going out for dinner after Shabbat some weeks. That was a real lifesaver for me in those first months here in DC. So thank you to everybody here who helps organize all those things and makes Micah such a continually welcoming place to be. Well, people often ask, how did I get interested in this topic of attachment? I'm not a psychologist. My background, as Robin said, is mostly in journalism, also in law, somewhat. And actually, in I studied journalism at Boston University, and the year I took Psych 101, I was also editing the school paper and staying up all night. So if I even made it to the psych class at 8 o'clock in the morning, as soon as those slides went on, the lights went off. So it's kind of ironic that I've written a book about psychology, having missed most of that one class. But the way I got into it is actually a very personal story, but I tell it in the book, so I'll share it with you. After 20 years of marriage and 3 kids, I was in a new relationship. It started great, as they all do, but then it got to be like riding an emotional roller coaster. There were lots of ups and downs and breakups and makeups, very turbulent. And I had not experienced that before. I was puzzled by it. I just didn't understand it. At around that time, I went to visit my daughter, Valerie, who was then a freshman at Boston University. And I picked up her psych book and was just leafing through it and came across this thing called attachment theory, which I'd never heard of. There was one section in the book where the authors describe what can happen when 2 people with what they call different attachment styles, I didn't know what that meant, try to become a couple. And it said, in one instance, there can be lots of ups and downs and breakups and makeups, and the relationship can be quite explosive and turbulent. And it went on to describe to a T what I had been experiencing. I was so intrigued, and I wanted to learn more. I didn't think at that point I'd spend the next 7 years researching the topic, but I did, and I never lost my fascination with it. I started out by contacting and talking with many of the top researchers in the field nationally. I read all the literature about it that I could. And I realized that while there were a few books about what's called attachment parenting, there was really no book that had been written explaining the influence of early attachment on how we become adults, how we behave as adults. and nothing written for the general reader that addressed that. So that became my goal. I wanted to write a book that explained, as I was learning, how early attachment affects our relationships throughout life. Our relationships with children, spouses, friends, aging parents, colleagues at work, teammates and coaches on sports teams, even our relations with political leaders, even our relationship with God. Because the literature supported all those types of effects. I want to add one other thing. In the course of my research, I found interesting studies that bear on the issue of Jewish continuity. And I don't mention this in my other talks, but we're at the shul, and I want to talk about this. There's some interesting research showing that the type of early bond we have with our children, whether it's secure or insecure, will affect whether that child as an adult chooses to follow in the religion he or she was raised in. And some of these studies are actually done with Jewish families. So toward the end of my talk, I want to get back to that topic. I think it's important. Okay, this is a good piece of trivia you might get to use someday. But I mention it to show how important, how to appreciate just how significant attachment theory is to 20th and 21st century psychology. Because there are only 2 psychologists who have ever officially had mountains named after them. And it isn't Freud. It isn't even Dr. Phil or Dr. Ruth. The 2 psychologists are the English psychologist, Dr. John Bowlby, who was the developer of attachment theory. He did most of his work between about 1950 and 1980. And the other is Dr. Mary Ainsworth, a Canadian-born psychologist who began as a research assistant to Dr. Bowlby and later went on to make her own groundbreaking contributions to the field. The only 2 psychologists who officially have mountains named after them. I think I'll also mention parenthetically, because we're at the shul, that in the course of my research, I came to see that many of the top attachment researchers, both nationally and internationally, are Jewish. It may not be so surprising because there's a lot of Jews involved in the field of psychology, but a lot of these researchers are in Israel. And Israel is a very big resource for attachment studies. Last time I was there, I got to meet some of the top people and talk to them about their work. And I asked myself, well, why is it that Israel would be such a center of attachment research? I don't actually know the answer to that, but I'm glad to speculate a little. I think one reason may be that when Israel was formed with a kind of socialist utopian idea, and we all remember that on the kibbutzim, children were raised collectively rather than with their individual parents. That turned out not to work so well. I've seen a lot of contemporary studies showing that those children as adults tend to have attachment issues. And of course, we didn't know that in 1950 when that was going on, but we do today. And I don't think many kibbutzim continue to have children raised away from their parents. I think the second reason Israel may be a kind of hub for this research is that there's some interesting studies showing the effect of early attachment on leadership quality and team cohesion. And the studies have been largely done using Israeli army troops and commanders. And it turns out to be quite important to know the attachment history of, say, a troop leader, or the attachment history of the men or women in a troop, to understand the the quality of leadership and the ability of that team to be a cohesive unit. So I think, I'm just guessing that I think that's why we see a lot of this work coming out of Israel. Because of the child rearing issue and because of the importance to state security through the Army. Here's attachment theory in a nutshell. Human beings are born helpless. So we are hardwired at birth to seek out and attach to a competent, reliable caregiver for protection. Okay, humans are born helpless. And if you go back, imagine the African savannah. A baby who does not successfully attach to an adult will get eaten by a tiger. So we are programmed at birth to have certain behaviors that are designed to help us find and attach to a protective caregiver. What are those behaviors? Things we see in every newborn. Reaching out with the hands, looking around with the eyes, crying. These are designed to help that baby survive. The reliable, competent caregiver. Usually that's the mom, but it's not a gender-specific role. It can also be the dad, the grandparent, a nanny, or another adult. But the quality of that first bond, whether it's loving and stable, or insecure, or even absent, actually will shape the developing brain and influence that individual throughout life, particularly in how that person deals with loss and how that person behaves in relationships. That's attachment theory in a nutshell. I want to take a minute and try to define some terms before we go ahead. This can be the boring part of the talk, but I'm going to really try to keep it short. I don't know how to get through the rest of it without doing this part. So what we call secure attachment happens when infants receive consistent, responsive care that meets their physical and emotional needs. Usually this happens in the first 18 months, 2 years, maybe up to 3 years of life. So what does consistent care mean? Well, it means that there's somebody, some adult, who is consistently available to the child for protection, who the baby perceives as its primary caregiver. Now, that doesn't mean that it can only be one person. There can be multiple caregivers. There can be mom, dad, grandparent, nanny, daycare worker. But there has to be one person who the baby at least perceives to be its primary caregiver. And that needs to be consistent for those first 2, maybe 3 years. And what do we mean by responsive care? We mean that the caregiver is able to correctly read the baby's signals. There was one researcher, I liked the way he put this. He said, babies don't come with instruction manuals. They are the instruction manual. And by their behavior, they tell us what we need. So responsive care means that the caregiver is able to correctly perceive the baby's signals and then respond accordingly. We call this attunement. You're being attuned to the baby. The caregiver understands when the baby wants to be stimulated and when the baby wants to be eased into sleep. The caregiver understands the difference between the baby's various cries. There's the I'm hungry cry, I'm tired cry, I'm fine but I just want to keep playing cry, and the I'm really scared now and I don't want to be alone cry. It's the ability to perceive those different signals and respond accordingly that you call attunement. And attunement plus consistency is generally the core of what we mean by parenting in a way that can best promote secure attachment. There are other factors, to be sure. There's genetics, there's temperament, there's family constellation issues, but in general, these are the two core core behaviors that will help produce secure attachment. So what happens if the caregivers fail to provide this type of early care? Well, then the baby's likely to develop either one of two types of what we call insecure attachment. If caregivers consistently fail to provide such care, we say the baby will develop what's called an avoidant attachment. And if the caregiver sometimes provides attuned care and sometimes doesn't, sometimes yes, sometimes no, that can produce what's called anxious attachment. So just to summarize, we've got three attachment styles we're going to talk about: secure, and then insecure avoidant, and insecure anxious. Everyone, including everyone in this room, has one of these three types of attachment style. There are matters of degree. People can be highly secure or mostly secure, highly avoidant or a little avoidant. But we all fall into these categories. And I want to talk now about how these play out in adult life. People who grow up with secure attachment, well, they get the big prize. They generally find it easy to trust others. They're comfortable with intimacy. They're resilient in the face of setbacks. And they're generally able to enjoy long, stable, loving relationships. That's kind of where you want to be. And it looked at, in the largest terms, in the general population, about 55% of adults come out of early childhood really blessed with secure attachment. Well, how about those people with insecure attachment? Well, they can have good, successful lives too. They are going to just have more challenges along the way. People with avoidant attachment, those who consistently fail to receive attuned care, generally find it harder to trust others and are not so comfortable with intimacy. In fact, they often don't see what the big deal is about relationships. They prize their independence. They like being self-reliant. People who are avoidant often are very successful in the professional or business worlds, partly because they are not encumbered by thinking about, feeling about relationships, loved ones, family. They're able to sort of fully focus on what they want to achieve. About 25% of the population tends to have an avoidant attachment. People with anxious attachment, on the other hand, and remember, these were infants who sometimes received attuned care and sometimes did not. As adults, they tend to crave intimacy. They're never satisfied unless they're in a relationship. And even when they're in a relationship, they're often not satisfied because they don't trust that their partners love them and will be there for them. There's a kind of push-pull aspect to their relationships because of that. When people with anxious attachment are hit with setbacks, such as illness, injury, loss of a job, loss of a loved one, they tend not to be very resilient and will often not be able to cope well. On the other hand, people with anxious attachment tend to be very sensitive to threats, which can often be a valuable protective tool. About 15% of the general population has an anxious attachment. Now, if you're doing the math, it doesn't quite add up to 100. It adds up to 95. There's one other category, I'm glad to talk about it, maybe in the Q&A. It's an important one, but I don't want to get too bogged down with that. So about 55% of the population has secure attachment, and almost half the population is walking around with insecure attachment. It's kind of important to remember. And learning our own attachment style, I believe, is really important. Remember that nature-nurture question. If we understand our own attachment style, we can unlock a lot of the answers to the nurture side of that equation and have much better understanding of how our personality was formed and why we behave in relationships the way we do, why we respond to stress and threats and loss the way we do. And with that knowledge, we're better able to regulate our own emotions and our reactions to life events. If we can achieve an understanding of other people's attachment styles, our spouses, our adult children, our close friends, it can let us be more patient, understanding, generous in the way we react to them and the type of help we're able to offer them. I've included in my book a very simple quiz. It takes about 5 minutes, but it can give you a pretty good idea of your own attachment style. I've also explained how to take a much more involved test called the Adult Attachment Interview, which is considered the gold standard for measuring attachment style in adults. Well, an early question I wrestled with in trying to write this book was, so we're through the boring part. Everybody make it through okay? Did we miss anyone? Okay. I wrestled early on with how do you write a book on this topic, which tries to convey information from complex academic fields like evolutionary biology, human development, social psychology, and still make it accessible, I hope even engaging to the general reader. Part of my answer to that, it seemed, was that I would have to tell a lot of stories, probably including my own. So that's how I began the book. I tell about my own early childhood, how my dad was my primary caregiver. I talk about taking the adult attachment interview, which I did here in Silver Spring, Maryland, with a psychiatrist I found who's certified to give that test. That's a very personal chapter, but I just felt it was necessary to include that. And I tried to confirm the assessment that came out of that interview by having an MRI done of my brain while I was being subjected to random electric shocks to see which regions of my brain would light up in response to stress. The things we do for art, really. I did that down at the University of Virginia in Charlottesville. Was one of the top researchers in neuroscience and attachment. He was very nice to let me do that, but I wouldn't do it again. But mostly in the book, I tell other people's stories. And with each chapter, part of the challenge and really the fun of doing this book was finding and getting to know people whose stories I could tell that would illustrate each of the topics in the book. I was still living in Rochester, New York most of the time when I started the book, so the early chapters are often based there. But about a third of the way through the book, I came down to DC, where I've been spending most of my time now. And so in the second 2/3 of the book, almost all the chapters are based in DC. And if you read the book, you'll recognize a lot of the locations and some of the people who I write about. There's chapters on attachment and friendship, on dating, on couples counseling, on aging. My own father sadly passed away while I was working on the book, and so I write about his death in that chapter and how his attachment style helped him get through the challenges of his last year. There's chapters on attachment in the workplace and sports and politics and religion, and as I say, they're all based here in DC. I just wanted to talk in the rest of my time here on a couple of topics I thought would be of interest. And the first is attachment at the workplace. I wanted to find an office or business where I could have access to all the employees, learn their attachment styles, and observe them interacting with each other, with supervisors, with customers, to kind of see whether their behavior was consistent with what I was reading in the scientific literature about how attachment style affects people in the workplace. And I got lucky because through a friend I was put in touch with the two guys who had founded the cafe in Adams Morgan called Pleasant Pops.
Oh.
Anybody know it? Yeah, one. If you haven't had a strawberry ginger lemonade ice pop, but would want to try it, that's the place to go. But they were very, very open. They gave me a complete run of the place, and I could talk to everybody. And I had everybody take the quiz. I knew everybody's attachment style. There were about 15 employees plus the two owners. And I spent about a month there observing. One of the things that I especially liked about that chapter is I was able to include some very cutting-edge new research. Studies that show that people with insecure attachment, avoidant and anxious, nevertheless have unique traits that they can bring to a work team. The way that researchers discovered this is kind of interesting. They had this very clever study. They brought, I don't know how many, let's say 10 people into a room. They knew all these people's attachment styles. And they asked them to look at a computer screen, some data that was being projected there. But what they didn't tell the participants was that they had rigged the computer to start smoking as if it were about to catch fire. And what they found was that the people with anxious attachment were the first ones to detect the smoke, first ones to detect the threat. And the people with avoidant attachment were the first ones to find a way out of the room. And so that, I love that study because it shows that we'd all like to have secure attachment, but we all don't. The people who have insecure attachment have some special traits too. And actually, the real kicker was a second study. It turns out that on a work team, on any work team, the most productive and successful results do not come when the team is composed entirely of people with secure attachment, but instead, when the team has a mix of people with secure, anxious, and avoidant attachment. So this gives a whole new spin to the notion of diversity in the workplace. And a company that was really smart would want to have people with those diverse attachment styles on a team. We might actually consider modifying the banner that we have at Temple Micah here. All attachment style. I'll let one of you suggest it. Okay, so let's wade into the swamp here and talk about attachment in politics. It's sometimes hard to believe, but politicians were once children too. So like all of us, they have attachment styles. And research shows that attachment styles will affect their behavior and decision-making process while in office. In writing the chapter, I had asked myself, but would any politician let me measure their attachment style in order to write about them? And as it turned out, actually, I was able to ask many of the questions from the adult attachment interview to several current and former members of Congress. And I was able to, myself, administer the full test to one very well-known national politician who I was able to get to through friends of friends, former governor of Massachusetts and Democratic presidential nominee Michael Dukakis. And I spent a very fascinating hour with Governor Dukakis in his office at Northeastern University going over this attachment interview. What I found from the interviews was that nearly all these politicians, actually with just one exception, measured as avoidant. I hadn't expected that. But I think this can be seen to have perhaps, definite effects on how some politicians behave. For example, you may recall that during Dukakis's presidential run, in one of the televised debates, he was asked the provocative question, if Kitty, your wife, was raped and murdered, would you still oppose the death penalty for the attacker? And in response, Governor Dukakis, without emotion, gave his standard statement in opposition to capital punishment. This was perceived as a gaffe by commentators, and some people think it contributed to Dukakis' losing the election. He didn't come off as very human in that response. But I asked the question, was it a gaffe? Because maybe not. I think instead, the governor's response to that question may have been an honest, if unfortunate, reflection of his avoidant attachment style. Because that's kind of what you'd expect a person with an avoidant attachment to say. My interviews with politicians comprise obviously only a very small sample, so it's hard to draw conclusions. But it has left me with a suspicion that avoidant people are overrepresented among politicians. I can go into the Q&A why I think that may be so. But if it is so, I think we are missing the chance to elect people with the potential, really, to inspire and uplift the country and truly be transformational. Because that's a role that researchers say can likely be fulfilled only by people who are themselves securely attached. Some of you might have seen my recent article in Politico where I tried to assess President Trump's likely attachment style. I brought some copies if you want. There's about 10 of them over there. And my conclusion was that he pretty much, I think, fits neatly within my hypothesis that most politicians are avoidant. For what it's worth, I think his 2016 opponent, Secretary Clinton, fits within that category too. And I'm glad to talk more about that later. Okay, my final topic I want to touch on is this Jewish continuity issue. As I wrote in the, I also brought the, I wrote about this in the article in the Tablet magazine. They titled it, "Want Your Kids to Remain Jewish? Better Start Early." My point there is that there are valid studies showing that that children who are raised with a secure attachment are more likely to follow in their parents' religion as they become adults. On the contrary, children who are insecurely attached are more likely to abandon the family religion or embrace another religion as converts. Some of these studies were done, for example, with 153 Orthodox families, and they found that those with insecure attachment were more likely to leave Orthodoxy. There were 11 other studies with people from many religions showing that children with insecure anxious attachment are more likely to suddenly convert to another religion. Not a gradual, thoughtful conversion as many people do, for example, before they marry, but a sort of a sudden conversion, even embracing a cult. And the speculation is that people who grow up with an insecure attachment, there's a kind of a hole that's never been quite filled. And that may engender a certain resentment or just a lifelong search for some way to fill that emotional hole. And some people find that they get filled up embracing maybe a cult figure or becoming a very zealous convert to some other religion, particularly the ones that offers a personal relationship with a deity. So I'm glad to talk more about this, but I do think that our Jewish institutions, Federation and JCCs and maybe temples, if we are offering parenting classes, we can emphasize this point, and we can teach how to be attuned parents and the ways of best instilling secure attachment, not only for the benefits, obviously, to the children, but for the benefits of Jewish continuity, which most of us at some level are concerned about. I haven't seen this talked about. We hear a lot about the benefits, and they are great benefits, of Jewish day schools and summer camps and trips to Israel. All that comes really quite late compared to providing a secure attachment at the beginning. I'm going to conclude with, I just want to do a very quick reading from the epilogue of my book. And this has to do with the birth of my first grandchild. And then we'll take questions. It's a hard thing to watch your own child in pain. But at the same time, I was grateful to my daughter Valerie for allowing me into her hospital room to witness, along with her husband, her sister, and her mother, the birth of her first baby. It was in Val's college psychology textbook that I had years earlier first read about attachment theory. And now, 6 years later, I was with her in a hospital room and about to see the real-life expression of the beginning of the attachment process. As Val labored, I was both humbled and exhilarated. Humbled because I was, of course, helpless to ease my daughter's pain. Exhilarated because to witness the birth of one's first grandchild, what a marvel. And then suddenly there came a little baby girl, a helpless new human being. I watched as she began searching with her eyes, moving her arms, and crying, all to find and attach to a caregiver for protection. That the new human being was my own granddaughter, and the caregiver, my daughter, was a joy and a wonder, and gave new meaning to all I'd been learning about attachment. Just over a year later, as I was finishing the edits of this book, my older daughter and her husband had their first child. And after a long labor, this time the grandfathers were not in the delivery room, they were blessed with a healthy son. And as I witnessed mother and son, I marveled at what seemed to me the beginning of yet another attuned and loving attachment bond. I have the chance to see these little ones often, and for that I'm grateful. As I watch them grow and see their parents working hard and thoughtfully to meet their attachment needs, my hope is that they, and all babies everywhere, will be blessed with attachment security and with the confidence, resilience, and easy ability to love that will be their lifelong reward. Thank you.
We have two guidelines here. One, please don't do any housekeeping while we're going through the Q&A. Just we'll clean up afterwards. Number two, please identify yourself so we all know who's asking questions. And Peter, you call him and I'll.
Okay.
Somebody in the room.
All right, how about in the back? Yes.
My name's Dale Brown, and I have a question.
Oh, hi, Dale, yeah.
Oh, hi, yeah. Hi. Anyway, here's my question. What about parents who want to provide secure attachment, but there's poverty? So they can't provide food, can't provide warmth. Was there any research on the ability, you know what I mean, the actual ability of the parent?
When you said, I didn't catch, they
Well, what I
can't
mean is
provide
like,
what?
you know, they can't provide food. You know, the baby's hungry, they can't provide food, baby's cold, maybe they can hug them, but they can't really get the baby warm. I mean, there's a lot that goes on in poverty-struck families that would make, you know, an attuned attachment difficult.
Okay.
And I just wondered what the research showed on that.
Yeah, well, so you've hit on the 5% I didn't mention. And I'm glad you did. It's not exactly a function of poverty, but it often is. There's another category of attachment called disorganized. This happens fairly rarely in the general population, often when children have been neglected or abused. And neglected would include lack of food. I mean, it may not be the parent's fault, but nevertheless. And these children are in the worst category. In the case of abuse, the child comes to fear the same person that they look to for protection. And it's an impossible situation to be in. In the general population, as I say, it's relatively rare. There's about 5%. But in areas of concentrated poverty, we see as high as 60, sometimes 80% of children with disorganized attachment. This is a real problem because these kids are, it's a very difficult thing to overcome. Having a disorganized attachment becomes a predictor of antisocial behavior, an inability to regulate one's emotions, so even to take advantage of things like Head Start or preschool. In adolescence, it can show up as antisocial aggressive behavior, later as delinquency, later as even violent criminality. The good news is there have been a number of ways designed to intervene with these kids at a very early age. And there's been at least a dozen different pilot studies done, and many show extremely high success rates, like cutting down disorganized attachment by half with kids. They're expensive because they usually involve sending specially trained therapists to a home to work with babies and moms for a week, weekly for a year. So they're expensive, but gosh, they're really cheap compared to the price of not doing that. So one thing I hope to do through this book is to advocate for more federal and state funding for these types of intervention programs. Yes. Okay, you.
It's over here, correct?
Yes. No, in the black.
If anybody else has a phone that they need to check, please make sure it's silent or off.
Hi, Roberta Gluck. Very interesting talk.
Thank you.
I'm wondering, when these surveys were done, the percentage of people that fall into each category, if it was done with people in our age group, we were probably, the majority of us, raised by a single stay-at-home caregiver. In the age of when there are multiple caregivers, could be a daycare center, could be a nanny, could be a mom, could be a dad, it could be all kinds of people. Does that impact in any way the percentage of people who come from secure attachment versus other levels of attachment?
Yeah, that's a great question, and one I've been more curious about. The problem is these assessments haven't really been done for more than about 40 years, maybe 30 years. So there aren't many past generations we can look at. What is interesting, I just saw a new study recently, this concerns me, that showed that compared the attachment styles of 25,000 college students 4 years ago and 24 years ago, if I've got it right. The percentage of insecure attachment in the current crop was 15% higher than in the earlier crop. And most of those, and the greatest increase was in avoidant attachment. That was up 56%. So this is pretty significant. And the authors of the study, they didn't look for the reasons, but they allow themselves to speculate. And some of the reasons they give that might have caused this are, first, that a lot of this generation has been raised by single parents, which in itself is not necessarily a problem, but by parents who are very overstressed due to work demands. And on top of that, these kids spend a huge amount more time looking at screen media and interacting with technology. And they speculate that the combination of those two things, maybe creating a generation which is far more avoidant than we've ever seen before. I think it's worth looking at. And I'm sure people will be doing more studies on that. Okay, how about over here? Oh, I'm sorry, I'm making you want. No, I shouldn't do that.
That's okay.
I'm sorry.
It's getting the steps in.
Right.
Okay.
Okay, so I'm Elizabeth E.
I'm Elizabeth Eby,
Hi, Elizabeth.
and Sid is helping me. Thanks, Sid. As I was listening to you, I was thinking about families, large families, urban families. Well, not necessarily urban families, but historically, there have been large families where the older sibling has taken care of the younger siblings. And that's a kind of interesting thing to follow, whether the attachment goes by age. And then, when, I'm gonna count on you to repeat my question.
Okay, is that your question?
No, well, then I have another part of that question.
One.
Well, but the guys, the children that you're talking about with single mothers, lots of them are children of veterans who died. And that's gotta be a different classification or category.
Okay, well, those are two good questions.
Could you repeat the question,
Yeah,
please?
the first question, Elizabeth was asking about the role of older siblings in being attachment. I mean, she actually hit it on the head. There are, an older sibling can definitely be an attachment figure for an infant. Actually, I experienced that myself. My older sister was 7 years my senior and was a kind of surrogate mother for me. But the studies bear that out. And so a baby that has an older sibling like that, I think the studies, as I recall, there are some gender differences, you know, infant boy, older girl, whatever, I forget how it works, but that definitely can enhance the attachment security of an infant. The second question was about single parents who are single because of a service member who was killed.
A tragedy,
Yeah,
just any kind of tragedy.
right, and that's, you know, people sometimes grow up with an insecure attachment because of a tragedy. Actually, I addressed this question in my article about President Trump, because his mom, he was the fourth or fifth of 5 children, and when his mother gave birth to the 5th sibling, he was just over 2 years old, and she had a very difficult labor which required follow-up surgeries and hospitalization. We're not clear exactly how long she was away, but it seems to be several months at a fairly critical period. There was a housekeeper, we're not sure what role she played. We're also not sure what role the older daughter might have played as a surrogate mom, but at any rate, there was a definite disruption at that critical point that could have, and it's all speculation, but it could have contributed to the avoidant attachment style that I'm guessing about, really. Sid, why don't you pick, and then just walk where you want.
Just walk around.
I wonder if you could comment on the, I'm Barbara Diskin.
Hi, Barbara.
I wonder if you could comment on the effect on attachment of parents and children being separated at the border.
Yeah, my book came out like 2 weeks before that happened, and gave me an opportunity to do some promotional, but I was sorry that was the reason for it. But yeah, clearly, removing children, particularly under 3, from parents at that critical period is going to have an effect on their attachment security. It'll vary with the family, the child. It might affect, it would vary depending on what the attachment experience was before that. Those who already have a secure attachment will probably show more resilience than those who started out without a secure attachment. the longer the separation would continue would be a factor. Not a good thing any way you slice it, though.
Hi, I'm Marcia Silcox. Is this a purely human construct, or is there a valid animal model that in mammals or invertebrates or others that, I'm a biologist, I'm looking for that kind of level of proof.
No, definitely, this applies to most mammals, particularly mammals where the infants are born helpless. I don't think there are any mammals where the infants are helpless as long as humans. I think when horses are born, the colts can walk or run within a couple days. But there are some of the early studies. Bowlby didn't do animal studies, but over in the United States at the University of Wisconsin, I'm losing the guy's name right now.
Olds,
Harry.
Olds,
No,
with the monkeys.
yeah, the monkeys. So the studies were done on rhesus monkeys being separated from their mothers, and that work was consistent with what Bowlby was doing in England. And there's still a good deal of attachment research done on other mammals.
Francie Schwartz.
Hi.
Hi. This is a very quick question. When you studied politicians, were they equally divided between Democrats and Republicans?
Yeah, I think they were, no, I didn't even think about that, but I think they were more Democrats. They just happened to be the ones I was able to get access to.
Sure.
Yeah.
Hi, Diana Seasonwine.
Hi, Dan.
First of all, I'm so impressed with how you pull together volumes and volumes of work on this topic.
Thank you.
This may be too academic a question, but the way the attachment chart is, I was thinking about an overlay of the Myers-Briggs and wondering, that would be an interesting study.
Yeah. I looked at Myers-Briggs, and I'm sorry, but the scientific literature does not support the validity of that. I know it's hugely popular, and they've made a really good living doing it. And it's kind of a handy thing, and I'd love to embrace it, but the studies that I consistently saw were not supportive of it scientifically, and part of that was that people's Myers-Briggs assessments were not regularly replicated. They would take the test one day and take it a month later, and they'd be, a completely different combination of traits. So I think it's fun to play with, but I don't see it in the same category as the science of attachment.
Hi, I'm Janet Ammerman.
I do.
If we focus on the caregiver instead of the baby for a second, let's assume, hypothesize, we have a mother who's the primary caregiver for her children, and she has 4 children. Is it possible that she does a great job of responding to the needs of the first kid, not such a great job with the second kid, and, so that the siblings all are raised in the same environment with the same caregiver, and all the other circumstances are basically the same, but they have different attachment styles, and could it be that the mother is just more in tune with the personality of one kid than another kid?
Yeah, and you touched on a good point there. There's a lot of reasons why siblings from the same family can grow up with different attachment styles. One could be the mother's ability to provide attuned care. There's what we refer to as, the family ecology can change. Economic support can change from one child to another. The quality of the parents' marital relationship can change. There can be depression in the family. There can be illness in the family. The child's temperament, inborn temperament, may affect the parent's ability to respond generously or not to that particular child. The behavior and welfare and healthfulness of the other children is a factor. So it's not unusual for children to come out of the same family with different attachment experiences.
Can you tell us what came out of the Israeli studies of their own troops in regard to what was necessary to have inspiring leadership and what didn't work?
I think in a nutshell, it's pretty consistently found that the best leaders are those with secure attachment for a number of reasons. And it plays out whether you're dealing with a troop of, 16, Israeli army troops or, political leaders. The troops themselves will have different levels of cohesiveness depending on the mix of attachment styles within the group and the attachment style of the group leader. So those are all factors that pretty consistently show up in the research. Sid, I want to be sure that Michael Newman here gets a question.
Sure.
Michael's a
No,
new,
Barbara
like a member.
Barbara already asked my question.
Oh.
You aren't right enough, but here's,
Okay.
here.
I have a question related to.
Wait a minute, Michael's going to come.
Mimi Wolf. I have a question related to foster kids. I can understand if they come from a dysfunctional family where they might end up having significant problems. But there are kids who end up in foster care because of situations after they might have had an attachment to a mother or father early on because of the circumstances. What happens to those kids? I thought a lot of those kids, when they moved from one household to another and then they moved to another household, that those kids frequently end up with personality disorders.
Again, like with the border separation question, I think a lot is going to depend on the early experience of that child. So if the child came into foster care with the resilience that a secure attachment might have offered, he or she is likely going to do better in the long run, even moving from family to family. A child who did not have that early resilience is going to be buffeted by some very difficult.
Is there evidence for that?
Yeah, well, I mean, I've seen studies that show that. But, in general, foster care is a tough row for kids. There's actually an interesting debate in the family courts these days where it was always the preference of family courts to award custody back to the birth parent whenever the birth parent was available, even if the child had already bonded to a foster parent. And that process doesn't look as wise from an attachment perspective. Because if the child has bonded successfully to the foster parent, and the foster parent is providing, a good secure attachment, you really don't want to give the child back to the birth parent at that point. So this is a current debate in that area.
Leah Rita Scott.
Hi.
Attachment disorder came to the forefront with the adoption, particularly of Romanian children. And a patient of mine became very involved in bringing this to the attention of organizations that were bringing children over, and realizing how much those who were adopting them needed to examine themselves as well as how to try and reverse. But as you were talking, I was thinking that when someone goes through therapy, and maybe because they have attachment problems, that the role of some therapists can be the vehicle for changing the dynamic by becoming the parent figure in the therapy process.
Well, I'm so glad that you raised that point, because I wouldn't want to leave the conversation without making this point, that about 75% of us will go through life with the same attachment style we had when we were 2 years old, with some variations. But it is possible to change. Statistically, about a quarter of people do change. And the way that happens is, there are several paths to that. Sometimes it happens because a young person is lucky enough to find a mentor, a teacher, a coach, somebody in usually early adolescence, who over time can fill in some of the security that was still lacking from early childhood. Sometimes it happens through therapy, and working with a therapist over a period of time, gaining insight into one's history can also achieve that. Sometimes people do it through their own parenting experience later in life, having time to reflect on their own childhood compared to what they're experiencing as parents has been shown to help people. And when people move from an insecure attachment to a more secure, it's called earned secure. It's a recognized category. And if any of you, for example, take the adult attachment interview, you might find that you come out earned secure based on experience you've had in life after age 1, 2, 3. Earned. Yeah. So are we just about out of time?
I want to ask Robin, are we have time for one more question, or we're done?
Do you have time for one more?
Yeah, I want to say that I'm glad to sign books here, and also there's a couple of those article reprints if anyone wants them. I just want to make one plea for signing books. So if if an author is at a place where you don't know anybody, like at a Barnes & Noble out of town, there's no problem signing books, because you just ask the person, what's your name, and then you sign the book. But if you're any place where you know some people or are expected to know people, at a certain age, this becomes a real challenge. Because there's some of you, if I run into you at Whole Foods, we could have a whole conversation.
We're all there.
And I will not know, cannot recall your name. Not a problem. But if you're sitting down, and if I'm sitting over here, and you say, and I say, well, who should I sign the book to? And you say, just sign it to me. There becomes a moment of truth. There's no way out of it. So all I ask is, I'm tremendously grateful if you buy the book to support Micah, but just be sure you tell me who I should write it to. Thank you.
Before we pick up, Peter, thank you for a marvelous presentation. A couple of announcements. Our next speaker on October 10th will talk about his experiences in Alaska and Vietnam. This is our own dentist, Stan Schulman, who has a fascinating story to tell. So put that on your calendar, please. If you have calendars that are just spilling over your desktops, Elka Booth would love to have them and share them with the homeless people of our community. They decorate their, sometimes if they have a home, they're essentials for them, and she's happy to pick them up from. We'll bring them to the next Lunch and Learn, not the Young Giver Services. Francie.
Thank you again for a marvelous, marvelous talk, which I think affected all of us in various levels and different ways. but this is going to be much more mundane. It's about garbage. As you walk this way, you'll see a big garbage can standing all by itself. Please scrape your garbage into the garbage can. Then enter by the right. You'll see a red, large container. Put your silverware there, and then just put your plates down. And leave. And thank you so much.
It's really nice to meet you.
think if I push this button, it stops?
And they're good people, so. It's a different world. Who sells the books? She'd like to buy one.
Karen Rosenbaum.
Where is she? I really
She
want.
might be over there with the dishes.
No, but I do want to. I'm gonna go home and blank this.
We're gonna try to find a way to make